Welcome, friend. Before we begin, allow yourself to arrive fully in this moment. There is nothing you need to solve right now, nothing you need to fix, and nowhere you need to go. You may be listening late at night or in the quiet hours before sleep, or perhaps during a moment when the world feels a little too heavy. Wherever you are, this time is simply for you. Take a slow breath. And as you exhale, let the day loosen its grip just a little. In life, we are often taught to push forward, to overcome, to resist what feels uncomfortable. When something difficult appears, our instinct is to fight it, to suppress it, or to run as far away as we can. But what if that belief itself is what keeps us restless? Across centuries of quiet observation, those who studied the mind discovered something unexpected. What we resist does not disappear. It lingers, it tightens, and sometimes it grows. And so tonight, we are not here to battle our inner world. We are here to sit beside it, gently, without judgment. You do not have to remember every word. You do not have to analyze or agree. Your only task is to listen and to allow the meaning to settle where it wishes. In the first story, we will explore what happens when we stop feeding what troubles us and instead meet it with a different kind of strength. Not the strength of force, but the strength of understanding. Long ago, there was a kingdom known for its order and beauty. Its palace stood at the center of the city, built from pale stone that caught the morning light and reflected it softly into the surrounding streets. Within its walls lived advisors, ministers, and servants who took great pride in maintaining harmony. Everything had a place. Everything followed a rule. And for a long time, this sense of control made the people feel safe. One quiet morning, without warning or announcement, something unusual appeared inside the palace. It did not arrive with thunder or fire. There was no dramatic entrance. It simply appeared. At first, it was small, barely noticeable. A strange figure standing in one of the outer halls, its shape unclear, its presence unsettling but easy to dismiss. Some thought it was a trick of the light. Others assumed it was a visitor who had lost their way. But as servants passed by, a feeling began to spread. Something about this presence felt wrong. Word traveled quickly. The palace guards were the first to approach. They demanded that the creature identify itself and explain why it was there. The creature said nothing. It only smiled. A wide, unsettling smile that revealed nothing, but seemed to mock the certainty of those standing before it. Annoyed and uneasy, the guards raised their voices. They shouted commands. They threatened punishment. And with every harsh word spoken, something strange happened. The creature grew, not dramatically at first, just enough for someone paying close attention to notice. Its shoulders broadened, its shadow lengthened, its smile widened ever so slightly. Still, no one understood the connection. The guards, convinced that force was the answer, moved closer. One of them raised his weapon. Another reached out to grab the creature's arm. The moment they did, the air in the hall seemed to tighten. The creature let out a low laugh, and suddenly it was no longer small. It had grown taller than the guards. Its body filled the space with an oppressive weight. The walls seemed closer now. The hall felt narrower. Fear replaced irritation. More guards were summoned. Officials arrived, dressed in fine robes, their faces tense with disbelief and anger. They argued loudly about what should be done. Some demanded immediate action. Others insisted the creature must be punished for defiling the palace. The creature listened, and it grew. Every insult fed it. Every threat strengthened it. Every attempt to dominate it made it more powerful. Soon it was impossible to ignore. Its presence overwhelmed the hall, then the corridors beyond it. Servants fled, advisors shouted over one another. The palace, once calm and orderly, filled with chaos. Still the creature did nothing. It did not attack. It did not move. It only absorbed. The more the people resisted its presence, the larger it became. What began as a minor disturbance was now a towering figure looming over the heart of the kingdom. Its shadow stretched across the palace floors, darkening rooms that had once been filled with light. Panic set in. "How do we get rid of it?" the officials cried. "Why won't it leave? Who allowed this to happen?" But no one had answers. They tried everything they knew. They shouted louder. They issued harsher commands. They sent more guards. And with every effort, the creature expanded as though their resistance was the very thing it needed to survive. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the palace no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt occupied, claimed, and beneath all the shouting and movement, there was an unspoken truth no one wanted to face. The harder they tried to push the creature away, the more firmly it seemed to stay. At the edge of the city, unaware of the turmoil unfolding, the king was returning from a journey. He had spent days traveling through villages, listening to the concerns of his people, moving at a slower pace than life inside the palace allowed. As his carriage approached the gates, he noticed something unusual. The air felt heavy. The guards at the entrance looked exhausted. Fear lingered where confidence once stood. The king stepped down from his carriage and asked a simple question. "What has happened here?" No one answered at first. Then voices tumbled over one another, each trying to explain, to justify, to blame. They spoke of the creature, of the chaos, of their efforts to remove it, of their failure. The king listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not rush. He did not react with anger or fear. When the explanations ended, he nodded slowly and made his way toward the palace halls where the creature still stood, immense and unmoving. As he approached, the noise faded. The shouting stopped. The palace held its breath. The creature turned its gaze toward the king, and for the first time since it appeared, something was about to change. The king stepped into the hall without hesitation. Where others had stopped at a distance, he continued forward. His pace unhurried, his posture relaxed. The creature loomed above him, massive, now its form pressing against the stone walls as if the palace itself had grown too small to contain it. The ministers held their breath. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons. Some turned their faces away, unable to watch what they believed would end in disaster. But the king did not raise his voice. He did not issue commands. He did not demand explanations. Instead, he stopped a few steps from the creature and looked at it carefully, as one might look at a guest whose arrival had been unexpected but not unwelcome. Then he spoke. "Welcome," the king said softly. The word echoed through the hall landing with more force than any shout or threat that had come before. The creature did not respond, but something subtle shifted. The king took another step forward. "You must be tired," he continued. "It seems you have been here for quite some time. I regret that I was not present to receive you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some thought the king had lost his senses. Others feared he was placing the kingdom in grave danger. But the king's voice remained steady, calm, free of tension. As he spoke, the creature changed. At first, it was almost imperceptible. Its shoulders lowered slightly, its shadow receded by a small margin. The king noticed. "You are among friends here," he said. "There is no need for hostility. If you have come with a message, you may speak. If you have come seeking something, we can listen." The creature's massive form trembled, not with anger, but with uncertainty. For the first time, it seemed unsure of itself. The king gestured to the attendants nearby. "Please," he said, "bring water, and perhaps a seat. Our guest should not be made to stand." The attendants hesitated, then obeyed. As they moved, something remarkable happened. The creature shrank. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but undeniably. It was still large, still imposing, but no longer filling the space with the same suffocating weight. The air in the hall felt lighter, easier to breathe. The king continued, speaking, his tone unchanged. "I sense that my household did not receive you with kindness," he said. "For that I apologize. Fear often causes us to forget our manners." The creature's smile faltered. Around them, the officials watched in stunned silence. Everything they had tried, force, threats, authority, had only made the situation worse. And yet here was the king offering courtesy, and the creature was responding. Slowly, cautiously, others began to follow his lead. One minister stepped forward. "Would you care for tea?" he asked, his voice unsteady but sincere. "We have a blend from the northern hills. It is quite soothing." The creature shrank again. A servant laid a cushion near the throne. "Please," she said quietly. "You may rest here." Smaller still. Each act of kindness seemed to weaken the creature's hold on the space. Its towering presence softened its features, less distorted its shadow, no longer reaching across the hall. The king observed this without surprise, as though he had expected nothing else. "You see," he said gently to those gathered, "some visitors grow stronger when they are resisted. Others fade when they are welcomed." The creature was now no larger than a person. Its breathing slowed. The tension in the hall dissolved. The palace, once on the edge of collapse, felt whole again. The king bowed slightly to the creature. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You have shown us something important." The creature lowered its head. Its form flickered like mist caught in shifting light. And then, without sound or struggle, it disappeared. There was no explosion, no victory cry, only quiet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, one of the ministers turned to the king. What was that thing?" he asked. The king smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. "Something we all know," he replied. "Something that feeds on resistance, and something that cannot survive without it." He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of those who had shouted, threatened, and fought so desperately. "Remember this," he said. "Not everything that disturbs us must be destroyed. Some things are asking to be met differently." The palace returned to its rhythm that day. The guards resumed their posts. The servants returned to their work. But something had changed. A quiet awareness lingered in the halls, a memory of how easily fear had turned order into chaos and how gently it had been undone. And long after the creature was gone, the lesson remained. What we fight, we strengthen. What we welcome, we transform. After the creature vanished, the palace did not return immediately to normal. There was a quiet that lingered different from silence. It was the kind of stillness that follows a deep realization, when words feel unnecessary and movement feels slow. The officials remained where they were, as if the hall itself were asking them to pause. Some looked at the empty space where the creature had stood, half expecting it to return. Others stared at the floor, replaying their own reactions in their minds. The guards loosened their stance, suddenly aware of how tense their bodies had been all morning. The king sat down, not on the throne, but on a simple chair near the center of the hall. "Tell me," he said gently, "what did you feel when it first appeared?" The question caught them off guard. One of the ministers spoke hesitantly. "Annoyance," he admitted. "It disrupted our order." Another added, "Fear. I felt we were losing control." A guard lowered his head. "Anger," he said. "I wanted it gone immediately." The king nodded as each spoke, offering no correction, no judgment. "These feelings," he said, "are not enemies. But when we push them away without listening, they find other ways to make themselves known." He stood and walked slowly through the hall, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone. "The creature did not come to harm us," he continued. "It came to show us how we meet what we do not want. Every shout, every threat, every attempt to dominate it was nourishment." Understanding began to settle among them, not as an idea, but as an experience they had just lived through. One of the younger attendants asked quietly, "So if we had welcomed it from the beginning, it would never have grown?" "Perhaps," the king replied, "or perhaps it would have stayed just long enough to be seen and then left on its own. Either way, it would not have ruled this place." The king paused near the entrance of the hall and looked back at the group. "This is not only about creatures that appear in palaces," he said. "It is about what appears in us. Anger, fear, shame, grief. We believe they are intruders. We treat them as threats, and then we wonder why they feel so overwhelming." No one argued. Each person there could think of a moment when they had tried to push away an emotion, only to feel it return stronger, louder, more demanding than before. When something difficult arises, the king said softly, "We have a choice. We can meet it with resistance and give it power, or we can meet it with presence and allow it to change." The lesson was simple, but it was not easy. It asked for patience instead of control, curiosity instead of judgment, kindness instead of force. That evening, as the palace lights dimmed and the city settled into rest, many carried the story of that day with them. Not as a tale of victory, but as a reminder that strength does not always look like conquest. Sometimes strength looks like opening the door. And long after the king retired for the night, the palace itself seemed to breathe more freely, as if it too had learned something about what it means to welcome rather than resist. And as this story comes to rest, you may begin to notice how often we try to push away what feels uncomfortable. Yet this understanding gently opens the way for another story, one that explores what happens when the challenge is not a moment or a feeling, but a person. There is a moment many of us recognize even if we have never named it. A thought appears in the mind, uninvited, unwanted. An uncomfortable feeling rises in the chest. A memory surfaces at the exact moment we wish it wouldn't. And almost immediately, something else follows. Resistance. We tense. We argue with ourselves. We say, this shouldn't be happening. We try to distract, suppress, replace, or outrun what has appeared. Yet somehow the more effort we put into pushing it away, the more persistent it becomes. The story of the palace and the creature is not an ancient curiosity. It is a quiet mirror of this everyday experience. The creature did not arrive as an enemy, but it became one the moment it was treated as such. In the same way, our inner struggles often grow, not because they are powerful by nature, but because of how we meet them. Consider anger. When anger arises, many of us respond with shame or fear. We tell ourselves that we should be calmer, kinder, more composed. We judge the feeling before we understand it. And in doing so, anger tightens its grip. It turns inward, becoming resentment, or it turns outward, becoming words we wish we could take back. Fear behaves the same way. When we refuse to acknowledge fear, it does not dissolve. It waits. It spreads quietly, shaping our decisions, narrowing our world, convincing us to avoid what might actually help us grow. Even sadness, when denied, has a way of settling deeper into the body, lingering longer than it needs to. This is why those who study the mind often say what we resist persists. Not because we are failing, but because resistance is a form of attention. The palace guards believed they were fighting the creature. In truth, they were feeding it. Every reaction confirmed its importance. Every attempt to remove it gave it more space. Our thoughts and emotions respond in much the same way. When we fight a thought, we return to it again and again. When we judge a feeling, we keep it close. When we label an experience as unacceptable, we trap ourselves in a struggle that has no clear end. Acceptance in this sense is often misunderstood. It does not mean approval. It does not mean surrendering to harm. And it does not mean that we stop caring. Acceptance simply means allowing something to exist long enough to be seen clearly. When the king welcomed the creature, he did not agree with its presence. He did not invite it to stay forever. He simply met it without fear. And in that meeting, the creature lost its reason to remain. There is a quiet wisdom in this approach. When we allow an emotion to be felt without labeling it as a problem, it often changes on its own. When we let a thought pass through the mind without chasing or rejecting it, it usually loses its urgency. What remains is space, and in that space, something new becomes possible. Many people discover this not through philosophy, but through exhaustion. After years of fighting themselves, they reach a point where resistance no longer feels sustainable. They stop asking, how do I get rid of this, and begin asking, can I sit with this? Just for a moment, that small shift changes everything. The struggle softens, the breath deepens, and what once felt overwhelming begins to feel workable. This does not happen instantly, and it does not happen perfectly. But it begins the moment we stop treating our inner experiences as invaders and start treating them as visitors, temporary, informative, and capable of leaving when they are no longer needed. As this understanding settles, it naturally raises another question. If emotions and thoughts can be met this way, what about people? What happens when the challenge we face is not inside us but sitting across the room? To explore this, let us move into another story, one that unfolds in a place devoted to peace, yet challenged by a single difficult presence. High in the mountains, far from the noise of cities and the pace of ordinary life, there was a monastery known for its calm. Those who lived there followed a simple rhythm. They woke before sunrise. They worked quietly. They ate in silence. And much of their day was devoted to sitting still, watching the breath, and learning to observe the mind without interference. Many came to the monastery seeking peace. Some arrived carrying grief. Others arrived exhausted by ambition, by conflict, or by a world that never seemed to slow down. The monastery promised none of these things would disappear, but it offered a place where they could be understood. Among the residents was a young monk who had joined with great hope. He believed that within the monastery walls, life would finally be free of disturbance. No arguments, no harsh words, no difficult personalities. He imagined days filled with clarity, compassion, and steady inner calm. For a while it seemed he was right. The mornings were gentle. The silence was deep. The teachings were kind. But then slowly something began to unsettle him. There was another monk in the community who stood out not because of wisdom or devotion, but because of how difficult he was to be around. This monk complained constantly. He criticized small mistakes. He interrupted others during work, and he seemed to carry an endless supply of irritation, spreading it wherever he went. At first, the young monk tried to ignore him. He reminded himself that irritation was a distraction. He focused harder on his breath. He told himself that patience was part of the path. But the more he tried to push the feeling away, the more aware of it he became. The sound of the monk's footsteps in the hallway caused tension to rise in his chest. The monk's voice during meals felt sharp even when the words were ordinary. A single comment could linger in his mind for hours. Confusion followed. Why is this happening here, he wondered. Isn't this place meant for peace? The young monk began to notice something uncomfortable. The calm he experienced in silence vanished the moment this other monk appeared. His mind filled with judgment. His body tightened, and afterward, he felt disappointed, not only in the other monk, but in himself. He avoided him when possible. He chose different work assignments. He sat on the opposite side of the meditation hall. Yet, avoidance brought no relief. Even when the monk was absent, thoughts about him remained. Conversations replayed. Imagined arguments unfolded. The young monk's meditation became restless, filled with irritation he believed he had left behind. Finally, feeling discouraged, he approached the senior teacher of the monastery. The teacher was an elderly monk who had lived there for decades. His movements were slow, his eyes clear. He listened without interruption as the young monk spoke about the irritation, the frustration, the confusion. When the young monk finished, he waited for reassurance. Perhaps the teacher would agree that the other monk was a problem. Perhaps there would be advice on how to correct his behavior, or at least permission to keep his distance. The teacher remained silent for a long moment. Then he smiled gently. "You are very fortunate," he said. The young monk was taken aback. "Fortunate," he repeated. "I feel anything but fortunate." The teacher nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Very fortunate indeed." The young monk did not understand, and yet something in the teacher's calm suggested that what he was about to hear would change the way he saw the situation entirely. In the next part of this story, we will explore why the teacher called this difficulty a gift and how a single person can become an unexpected guide on the path to understanding. The young monk sat quietly, waiting for the teacher to explain. "How can this be fortunate?" he asked at last. I came here to find peace. Instead, I feel more disturbed than ever." The teacher gestured for him to sit beside him on the low wooden bench outside the meditation hall. The afternoon air was cool, and the sound of wind moving through the trees filled the space between them. "Tell me," the teacher said, "how is your meditation when you're alone?" The young monk considered this. "It is calm," he replied. "I can follow my breath, my thoughts settle." "And when you are near this monk?" the teacher asked. The young monk sighed. "Everything changes. My body tightens. My mind fills with judgment. I lose my balance." The teacher nodded slowly. "Then you have learned something very important." The young monk looked puzzled. "Anyone can feel peaceful when nothing is challenging them," the teacher continued. "But the purpose of practice is not to create perfect conditions. It is to understand the mind when conditions are imperfect." The teacher picked up a small stone from the ground and held it in his palm. "If you sit in silence and feel calm," he said, "that calm may be real, but it has not yet been tested. This monk you find so difficult is testing it for you." The words settled heavily. The young monk felt a mix of resistance and recognition. He wanted to disagree, yet something in the teacher's tone made it hard to dismiss. "So you are saying," he began slowly, "that this monk is here for me?" The teacher smiled. "Not for you," he said, "but with you, as part of your training." The young monk looked down at his hands. He thought of all the hours he had spent avoiding the other monk, all the energy consumed by irritation and silent resentment. "But it feels unfair," he said quietly. "I didn't choose this." The teacher nodded. "No one chooses their teachers," he replied. "They appear." He placed the stone back on the ground. "The people who disturb us," he said, "show us where our understanding is still incomplete. They reveal the places where patience is thin, where pride hides, where compassion has not yet grown strong." The young monk felt a subtle shift inside him. Not relief, but curiosity. "What should I do?" he asked. For now, the teacher said, "Do nothing differently on the outside. Do not confront him. Do not avoid him. Simply notice what happens in you when he is present." The teacher leaned forward slightly. "Each time irritation arises," he continued, "do not push it away. Do not justify it. Observe it as you would observe the breath. Let it teach you." That evening, the young monk returned to his duties with a different awareness. When the other monk complained during work, irritation rose just as before. But this time, instead of reacting, the young monk noticed the sensation in his chest. Tight, warm, uncomfortable. He breathed. When criticism came during the evening meal, judgment appeared in his mind. The familiar story formed. He is impossible. He ruins the peace. But now something new accompanied the thought recognition. This is what the teacher was pointing to. The irritation did not vanish, but it softened. It no longer felt like an enemy that needed to be defeated. It felt like information. Over the following days, the young monk continued this quiet experiment. Each encounter became a lesson. Each reaction became a signal. Each moment of discomfort revealed something about his own expectations. He began to see that much of his suffering did not come from the other monk's behavior, but from his belief that the monastery should be free of such behavior. And that belief, once questioned, began to loosen. Over time, the young monk noticed something unexpected. The difficult monk had not changed. He still complained, he still criticized. His presence was still sharp at the edges. And yet the young monk's experience of him was no longer the same. Where irritation once surged immediately, there was now a brief pause. A space just wide enough to notice what was happening inside. The tightening in the chest, the quickening of the breath, the familiar urge to judge or withdraw. Instead of reacting, he stayed. He listened to the words without rushing to defend himself. He felt the discomfort, without labeling it as a failure. And slowly, the intensity began to lessen. Not because the situation improved, but because his relationship to it did. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, the difficult monk complained again. This time his voice carried a hint of weariness beneath the irritation. Without thinking, the young monk looked at him and saw something he had not noticed before. Tired eyes, a rigid posture, a tension that never seemed to leave his body. For the first time, curiosity replaced resentment. That evening during meditation, the young monk realized something quietly profound. The monk he had judged so harshly was suffering, and much of that suffering had nothing to do with him. The next day, when criticism came, the young monk felt it land differently. It still stung, but it no longer defined the moment. Compassion appeared, not forced, not dramatic, but natural. He did not excuse the behavior. He did not pretend it was pleasant, but he no longer needed it to be different in order to remain at ease. Weeks passed. One morning, as they walked together to their duties, the difficult monk spoke in a softer tone. "You don't react the way you used to," he said. "Most people do." The young monk was surprised. "I'm just paying attention," he replied honestly. The other monk nodded as if considering this. There was no apology, no confession, but something between them had shifted. Later that day, the young monk sought out the teacher once more. "I think I understand now," he said. The problem was never only him. The teacher smiled. "Very good," he replied. "And what else have you learned?" "That the people who disturb us," the young monk continued, "are showing us where we still cling to how things should be." The teacher's smile widened. "Yes," he said, "and when that clinging loosens, what happens?" The young monk reflected for a moment. "There is more space," he said, "for understanding, for compassion, even for peace." The teacher nodded. "Then your training is working." The young monk returned to his practice with a deeper appreciation for the monastery, not as a place free of difficulty, but as a place where difficulty could be met with awareness. He no longer wished for the other monk to disappear. In some quiet way, he was grateful for his presence, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. And in that honesty, the young monk discovered something essential. Peace does not come from perfect conditions, but from the ability to remain open when conditions are not perfect. As this story settles, it invites us to reflect on the subtle ways our interactions shape us over time. And to understand this more deeply, we turn to a simple image, one that reveals how friction itself can become a quiet teacher. In a quiet valley not far from the monastery, there was a narrow river that flowed steadily through smooth stone banks. At first glance, the stones lining the riverbed appeared ordinary, gray, rounded, unremarkable, but anyone who paused long enough to look closely would notice something unusual about them. They were remarkably smooth. There were no sharp edges, no jagged corners, no rough surfaces left behind. Each stone felt softened by time, shaped by something patient and persistent. A visiting student once asked an elder monk about them. How did they become like this? He wondered aloud. They look as though they have been carefully polished. The monk smiled and gestured toward the flowing water. They polish one another, he said. The student frowned slightly, not understanding. The monk bent down, lifted 2 stones from the river, and held them in his hands. These stones, he said, were once sharp. If you had touched them centuries ago, you would have felt their edges immediately. He placed them back into the stream, but they did not become smooth by resting alone. The monk continued. They became smooth because they stayed here where they were, pushed, rubbed, and struck against one another again and again. The student watched the water move over the stones. It flowed without effort, yet never stopped. The stones shifted slightly as the current passed, touching, pressing, colliding. So, friction is what shapes them, the student asked. Yes, the monk replied. Friction and time. The student thought about the monastery, about the difficult monk, about the irritation that had once felt like an obstacle to peace. Then why does friction feel so unpleasant? He asked. If it helps us grow, why does it hurt? The monk laughed softly. Because growth does not ask for our permission, he said. In our lives, we often imagine peace as stillness, no conflict, no resistance, no challenge. We believe that if we could just remove the people who frustrate us, the situations that press against us, and the emotions that unsettle us, we would finally feel whole. But like the stones in the river, we are shaped by contact. When everything agrees with us, our sharp edges remain hidden. When nothing challenges us, our habits go unexamined. It is only when we are rubbed the wrong way that we discover where we are rigid. Consider how quickly irritation reveals expectation, how criticism exposes pride, how disagreement uncovers attachment to being right. These moments feel uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because something is being revealed. The stones do not resist the river. They do not choose which other stones they will touch. They remain, and in remaining, they change. We, on the other hand, often spend great energy trying to avoid friction. We rearrange our lives to stay comfortable. We withdraw from difficult conversations. We label people as problems and move away from them whenever possible. And sometimes this is necessary. But when avoidance becomes a habit, something else happens. We remain sharp, not because we are unkind, but because we have not been shaped. The monastery student began to see the river differently. Each stone was not competing with the others. They were not trying to smooth themselves. They simply stayed in contact long enough for transformation to occur. In the same way, when we stay present with difficulty, without aggression, without avoidance, we allow the edges of our reactions to soften. This does not mean tolerating harm. It does not mean enduring abuse. It means recognizing the difference between discomfort that wounds and discomfort that teaches. Much of what irritates us daily falls into the second category. A tone of voice, a differing opinion, a habit that clashes with our own. These are the gentle collisions of the river. Over time, the student noticed something else. The stones at the river's edge, untouched by the current, were rougher, less refined. Their edges remained intact because they had been spared contact. He understood then why the teacher had not encouraged escape from difficulty, but awareness within it. Because without friction, there is no polishing, and without patience, no stone becomes smooth. As this image lingers, it naturally leads us to another realization that those who disturb us often carry their own unseen weight. To understand this, we move into a story that invites compassion, where judgment once lived. There is a quiet thought that can change the way we see difficult people, once it is truly understood. It often arrives not as an idea, but as a realization. They have to live with themselves. Most of the time when someone irritates us, we focus entirely on how their behavior affects us. The sharp tone, the impatience, the constant criticism or negativity. We experience these moments as interruptions to our peace, and it feels natural to place responsibility outside ourselves. But rarely do we pause to consider what life might feel like inside that person. The monk in the monastery had begun to sense this shift. As his resistance softened, space opened for a different kind of seeing. He noticed how the difficult monk rarely rested, how his shoulders stayed tense even in moments meant for ease, how his complaints seemed less like attacks and more like habits formed around discomfort. It became clear that the irritation he caused others was only a small part of a much larger experience, one he carried with him constantly. Many people who are hard to be around are not enjoying themselves. They are not waking up each morning eager to disturb others. More often, they are caught in patterns of thought and emotion they do not know how to escape. Patterns that repeat day after day without relief. Imagine having a mind that rarely rests, a body that is always braced, a voice inside that criticizes everything, including yourself. Now imagine never being able to step away from that. This is the quiet reality for many who appear difficult on the outside. And when this is seen clearly, something begins to change. Not sympathy, not pity, but understanding. Understanding does not excuse harmful behavior. It does not mean we accept mistreatment or abandon boundaries, but it does allow us to respond without adding more hostility to an already heavy inner world. The monk realized that every time he reacted with anger, he was entering the other monk's struggle and amplifying it. Their interactions became a meeting of tensions, each reinforcing the other. But when he met irritation with steadiness, something else happened. The exchange ended sooner. The energy did not escalate. The moment passed. This was not because the difficult monk suddenly became pleasant, but because there was no longer resistance to push against. In daily life, this principle reveals itself in small ways. A colleague who complains endlessly may be deeply dissatisfied with their own direction. A family member who criticizes may be carrying unspoken fear or regret. A stranger who reacts harshly may be moving through a pain we cannot see. When we remember that they must live with their own thoughts long after the interaction ends, it becomes harder to take their behavior personally. We stop asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" and begin asking, "What must it be like to be them?" This question does not require an answer. It only requires a pause. And in that pause, the grip of resentment loosens. In the next part, we will explore how this shift in perspective can quietly transform the way we relate to others, without forcing change or demanding understanding. As the monk held this new understanding, something subtle but important shifted in the way he moved through his days. The difficult monk was still difficult. The complaints did not stop. The sharp comments still appeared without warning. But now, each interaction carried less weight. When irritation arose, the young monk no longer added a second layer of struggle by asking, "Why is he like this?" or "Why can't he just change?" Instead, he noticed the impulse itself, the tightening, the judgment, the urge to pull away, and allowed it to pass without feeding it. He began to see that many people who cause discomfort are not acting from confidence or strength, but from a lack of ease with themselves. Somewhere along the way, they learned to protect themselves by criticizing first, by controlling what they could, by keeping tension close as if relaxing might expose something fragile. This insight did not come with dramatic compassion or emotional warmth. It arrived quietly, as acceptance often does. The monk did not suddenly feel fond of the other man. He did not seek his company. He did not pretend the behavior was harmless, but he stopped making it personal. And that changed everything. In one small interaction after another, the monk practiced this new way of seeing. When a complaint came, he listened without absorbing it. When criticism appeared, he responded simply, without defensiveness. And when irritation surfaced inside him, he treated it as information, not a command. Over time, he noticed that these moments passed more quickly. The conversations ended sooner. The emotional residue faded faster. His mind no longer replayed encounters long after they were over. It became clear that much of his suffering had never come from the other monk's words, but from the story he told himself about them. The story that said, "This shouldn't be happening." The story that said, "I am being wronged." The story that said peace depends on his behavior changing. When those stories loosened, peace became less conditional. Outside the monastery, this understanding plays out in countless ordinary moments. A driver cuts us off and anger flares. A co-worker dismisses our idea and frustration follows. A loved one repeats the same habit that has always bothered us. In each case, we face a choice. We can add resistance, tightening the moment, extending the discomfort, or we can remember that the other person carries their own inner weather shaped by experiences we may never know. This does not mean we accept everything. Boundaries remain important. Distance is sometimes necessary. But when action is needed, it can arise from clarity rather than reactivity. The monk discovered that responding from clarity required far less energy. He slept more easily. His meditation deepened, and his attention returned to the present instead of being pulled into endless inner debates. One evening, as the monastery settled into silence, the young monk reflected on how far his understanding had come. He realized that the phrase "they have to live with themselves" was not meant as a judgment, but as a reminder. A reminder that many people are already struggling long before we encounter them. A reminder that we do not need to add to that struggle, and a reminder that protecting our own peace does not require winning every interaction. Sometimes peace comes from stepping back just enough to see the full picture. And sometimes compassion begins not with warmth but with restraint, the decision not to harden in response to what is already hard. As this understanding settles, it opens the door to another perspective, how what we choose to notice in others can quietly shape who they become. There is a subtle force at work in every human interaction, one that often goes unnoticed. It is not spoken aloud,
It is not written into rules or agreements, and yet it shapes behavior more powerfully than most words. It is attention, what we consistently notice in others, what we highlight, expect, and react to, has a way of growing. Not because people consciously decide to become what we see, but because attention acts like light. Whatever it rests upon becomes warmer, more active, more alive. In the monastery, the young monk began to observe this principle quietly, without trying to test it or prove it. He noticed that when the difficult monk entered a room, the tension often arrived before he spoke. People braced themselves, shoulders tightened, faces hardened just slightly. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something unpleasant to happen, and often it did. But one afternoon, something different occurred. The difficult monk entered the work hall later than usual. He looked tired. His movements were slower, less sharp. He said nothing at first, and for once no one reacted. No glances, no sighs, no subtle signals of impatience. The young monk remained focused on his task, not out of avoidance but out of neutrality. He did not prepare himself for irritation. He did not search for something to tolerate. He simply stayed present. A few moments passed. Then the difficult monk spoke. "I might have done this wrong," he said, holding up his work. His voice was quieter than usual. The room felt different. Someone nearby looked up and answered calmly. "It looks fine," he said. "If you'd like, we can check it together." The difficult monk nodded. That was all. No complaint followed. No criticism. No tension filled the space. The young monk noticed how brief the interaction was and how little energy it consumed. He realized that something important had shifted, not in the other monk but in the field around him. When we expect difficulty, we prepare for it. When we prepare for it, we respond in ways that invite it, and when it arrives, we feel confirmed in our expectations. But when expectation softens, space opens. This principle extends far beyond the monastery walls. In a hospital ward, a nurse once noticed that a particular patient was labeled difficult. Staff approached him with caution, impatience already present in their voices. Interactions were tense. Requests were framed defensively, and the patient responded with frustration. One day, a new nurse arrived who had not read the notes. She entered the room without assumptions. She spoke gently. She listened without rushing. She noticed moments of cooperation rather than resistance. The patient behaved differently with her, not because he had changed overnight, but because he was no longer being met as a problem to manage. What we consistently attend to in others, especially the negative, can trap them in a narrow role. Over time, they may even begin to identify with it. The difficult one, the unreliable one, the angry one. But when attention shifts even slightly, something else becomes possible. This does not mean ignoring harmful behavior. It does not mean pretending problems do not exist. It means recognizing that people are more than the traits we highlight. The young monk began to experiment quietly. When the difficult monk spoke harshly, he noticed the fatigue beneath it. When complaints arose, he noticed the fear of things being wrong. When silence appeared, he allowed it to remain without filling it with expectation. Over time, these moments accumulated, and something gentle began to emerge. In the next part, we will see how sustained attention, when guided by patience rather than judgment, can invite change without force. Change did not arrive all at once. It never does.
It appeared gradually in moments so small they could easily have been missed. The difficult monk still carried his habits. His words were sometimes sharp. His tone still rose when things did not go as expected. But now there were pauses between these moments, spaces where something else had room to appear. The young monk noticed that when irritation was no longer mirrored back to him, it lost momentum. Complaints ended sooner. Criticism softened mid-sentence. And occasionally, silence replaced what once would have become conflict. This was not the result of effort or strategy. It was the result of attention without judgment. When people feel watched for their flaws, those flaws tighten. When they feel seen only as problems, they defend themselves as problems. But when they sense neutrality, or even quiet respect, the need to protect begins to ease. The young monk realized that attention could either confine or release. One evening, during a communal meal, the difficult monk hesitated before speaking. This alone was unusual. When he finally did, his voice lacked its usual edge. "I may have been too harsh earlier," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. No one responded immediately. There was no praise, no correction, no dramatic acknowledgement. The moment passed simply naturally. And yet something profound had happened. The monk had stepped outside the role he had been trapped in for so long. Not because someone demanded it, but because the environment no longer reinforced it. The young monk understood then that people often live up or down to the expectations placed upon them.
When we expect someone to be difficult, we interact in ways that confirm it. When we expect resistance, we speak defensively. When we expect failure, we tighten control. But when expectation loosens identity, loosens with it. This insight can be unsettling. It asks us to examine how often we participate without realizing in sustaining the very behaviors we dislike. How often we label others, then respond to the label rather than the person in front of us.
The monk did not tell others what he was learning. He did not preach. He simply practiced. And over time, the monastery felt different. Not because everyone became harmonious, but because conflict no longer defined relationships. It passed through more quickly. It left less residue. The difficult monk did not become easy, but he became human. And in seeing him that way, the young monk discovered something quietly liberating. We do not have to change others in order to change our experience of them.
Sometimes all that is required is a shift in where we place our attention. As this understanding settles, it naturally leads us to another story, one that shows how patience and kindness applied consistently can soften even the most guarded heart.
In a place surrounded by high walls and locked doors, patience was not a quality that came easily. The building was old, built from thick stone that absorbed sound and light alike. Narrow windows allowed only a muted version of the outside world to enter. Inside, routines were rigid. Movements were monitored, and emotions, especially gentle ones, were considered a liability. This was a prison. Each day followed the same pattern. Doors opened, doors closed. Orders were given. Rules were enforced. The people who worked there learned over time to protect themselves by hardening. Softness was seen as weakness. Distance was safety. Among the staff was a guard known for his severity. He was efficient. He followed protocol precisely, and he spoke very little. When he did speak, his words were sharp and final. Prisoners avoided him when they could. Other guards respected him but kept their distance. There was something impenetrable about him, as if years of exposure to anger and despair had taught him to build walls not only around others but within himself. One afternoon, a new worker arrived at the facility. He was not a guard, but a simple attendant assigned to serve tea and meals during breaks. His role was small, almost invisible. He moved quietly through the corridors, offering cups, refilling kettles, clearing tables. On his first day, he noticed the tension immediately. The way voices dropped when certain guards entered the room. The way shoulders tightened without conscious thought. The way silence was used as a shield. The severe guard was impossible to miss. When the attendant approached him with a cup of tea, the guard did not look up. He did not acknowledge the gesture. He did not say thank you. The attendant placed the cup down gently and moved on. The next day, the same thing happened, and the day after that. Each time the attendant offered tea with the same calm presence. No forced cheer, no expectation of response, just a quiet act repeated with care. The other staff noticed. "Why do you bother with him?" one guard asked. "He never responds." The attendant smiled softly. "That's all right," he said. "The tea is still warm." Days passed, weeks, nothing changed. The severe guard remained distant. His expression never softened. His silence remained intact. If anything, his demeanor seemed to discourage interaction even more strongly. It would have been easy to stop. Many would have concluded that kindness in this case was wasted, that some people were simply unreachable. That effort should be saved for those who respond. But the attendant continued, not because he believed it would work, not because he expected gratitude, but because the act itself felt complete even without a result. Each afternoon he placed the cup down. Each afternoon he stepped away. Each afternoon nothing happened on the surface. What no one could see was what these moments stirred beneath the guard's still exterior. At first there was irritation. Why does he keep doing this? Why doesn't he get the message? The guard told himself it meant nothing. He dismissed it as routine. But somewhere beneath the practiced indifference, something was being noticed. Consistency. The attendant's presence did not change with mood. It did not react to silence or coldness. It did not withdraw when ignored. This unsettled the guard more than open confrontation ever had. He was accustomed to resistance, to fear, to hostility. But this quiet persistence offered nothing to push against. Days turned into months. One afternoon, as the attendant placed the tea down as usual, the guard's hand paused mid-motion. He looked at the cup. Then, without lifting his eyes, he spoke. "Why do you always do that?" The attendant stopped, surprised, but not startled. He considered the question for a moment. "Because it's my job," he said gently, "and because tea is better when it's shared." The guard said nothing more, but something had shifted. The next day, when the cup was placed down, the guard nodded once, barely noticeable, almost accidental. The attendant returned the nod and walked away. No smiles, no words, no acknowledgement beyond that small gesture. Yet in that moment, a door had opened just enough for light to pass through. In the next part of this story, we will see how patience, when practiced without demand, can soften even the most carefully guarded heart. The nod did not change the guard's reputation. He remained strict. His voice was still firm. His presence still carried weight. But for the attendant, That small movement was not insignificant. It was not a victory, and it was not a sign to expect more. It was simply a moment of contact, brief, unremarkable to anyone else, yet quietly meaningful. And so the routine continued. Each day the attendant brought tea. Each day he placed the cup in the same spot. Each day he moved on without lingering. The guard no longer ignored the gesture entirely. Sometimes he glanced at the cup. Sometimes he drank it before it cooled. Sometimes he left it untouched. But the tension that once filled the space between them had softened just enough to be felt. The other guards noticed as well. "He spoke to you," one asked incredulously. "Barely," the attendant replied. "That's enough." What they did not understand was that something had already begun to shift, not in the guard's behavior, but in the inner posture that held it together. For years, the guard had lived behind rules. Rules created order. Order created distance. Distance created safety. Every day, he faced anger, regret, and desperation. He learned early that allowing these things too close came at a cost. So he closed himself off. He became efficient, impenetrable, unreachable. The attendant's quiet presence did not challenge this directly. It did not ask the guard to change. It did not accuse him of being cold or unkind. It simply remained. This was unfamiliar. One evening after a particularly long shift, the guard found himself alone in the break room. The attendant entered, placed the tea down, and turned to leave as usual. "Wait," the guard said. The word surprised both of them. The attendant stopped and turned. "Why?" the guard asked slowly. "Do you never say anything else?" The attendant considered this carefully. "Because you never asked," he said. There was no judgment in his voice, only honesty. The guard looked down at the cup. Steam rose gently from its surface. "You know," he said after a pause, "most people try to get something from me." The attendant nodded. "I imagine they do." "And you?" the guard asked. "I just bring the tea," the attendant replied. Silence followed. Not the tense silence of avoidance, but something quieter, something thoughtful. From that day on, the guard began to notice details he had long ignored. The way the attendant moved without rushing, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he did not withdraw when spoken to harshly. These qualities did not demand trust, they invited it. Weeks passed. The guard spoke more often now, brief comments, practical observations, nothing personal. But each exchange chipped away at a long-held assumption that every interaction was a negotiation, a test of strength. The attendant never pushed further. He did not ask questions. He did not probe. He did not turn kindness into an obligation. And because of that, the guard found himself doing something unexpected. He began to speak without being prompted. One afternoon, after the attendant placed the tea down, the guard said quietly, "It's strange. You know being here." The attendant waited. "You see the same faces every day," the guard continued. "The same mistakes, the same anger. After a while, you forget how to be anything else." The attendant nodded. "That sounds heavy." The guard exhaled slowly as if he had been holding his breath for years. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was a moment of truth spoken aloud. From that day forward, the guard's demeanor changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. He still enforced rules. He still maintained order. But his voice softened at the edges. His eyes lingered a moment longer. His presence no longer closed the room in on itself. and it all traced back to something deceptively simple. A cup of tea, offered without expectation, returned without demand. The attendant never claimed credit. He did not speak of transformation. He simply continued his work, aware that some changes happen not because they are forced, but because they are allowed. And in that understanding, a deeper lesson revealed itself. Kindness that seeks results often fails, but kindness that stands on its own can reach places force never will. In the final part of this story, we will see how a single moment, quiet and uncelebrated, can mark the true beginning of change. The moment that marked the true beginning of change did not arrive with ceremony. There was no dramatic conversation, no sudden warmth, no visible turning point that others could point to and say, "That was it." It came quietly, almost unnoticed. One late afternoon, the prison corridors were unusually still. The day had been long. Tensions had run high earlier, and exhaustion hung in the air like a heavy fog. The attendant moved through the familiar routine kettle, in handcuffs balanced carefully. When he reached the guard, he placed the tea down as always. But this time, before the attendant could step away, the guard spoke. "Sit," he said. The word was not an order. It was tentative, uncertain, as though the guard himself was surprised to hear it. The attendant hesitated only briefly, then pulled out a chair and sat across from him. They did not speak at first. Steam rose from the cup between them, filling the silence with warmth. After a moment, the guard said, "Most days I forget what kindness feels like." The attendant listened. "It's not that I don't believe in it," the guard continued. "It's just easier not to expect it." The attendant nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said. The guard studied him. "You don't try to fix things," he said. "You don't ask questions. You just show up." The attendant smiled faintly. "Showing up is often enough." The guard looked away, his jaw tightening briefly before relaxing again. Something old and heavy was loosening its grip. That day, the conversation ended there. No promises were made, no resolutions declared, and yet something essential had shifted. From then on, the guard began to treat others differently, not because he had decided to be kind, but because the need to defend himself had softened. He still enforced rules. He still maintained order, but his voice no longer carried the same edge. When a prisoner spoke out of turn, he corrected him without humiliation. When tension rose among staff, he intervened without escalation. And when the attendant arrived with tea, he looked up. Sometimes he even said, "Thank you." The other guards noticed. "What happened to him?" one asked quietly. The answer was not simple. No one had argued him into change. No one had demanded vulnerability. No one had forced reflection. Instead, something steady and unassuming had remained long enough to be trusted. The attendant never spoke about the guard's past. He did not need to. The guard carried it with him every day, years of witnessing anger, regret, and despair. Years of learning that distance was safer than connection. Kindness, when it finally reached him, did not arrive as warmth or comfort. It arrived as consistency, the same gesture, the same presence, the same lack of demand. Over time, the guard realized that this consistency required strength, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that endures without hardening. And in recognizing that strength, he found permission to soften. One evening, as the attendant prepared to leave for the day, the guard spoke again. "You know," he said, "most people only see this place for what it takes away." The attendant waited. "But you," the guard continued, "you remind me that something can still be given." The attendant smiled. "Even here," he said. "Yes," the guard replied. "Even here." When the attendant left, the guard remained seated, holding the empty cup. The room felt quieter than usual. Not empty, but settled. The lesson of that place did not spread through announcements or policy changes. It moved slowly, carried through small interactions. A softer word here. A pause before reacting there. A moment of restraint where force once felt necessary. None of it dramatic, all of it real. The story of the tea was never told as a story within those walls. It did not need to be. Its impact lived in the way people began to meet one another with just a little less armor and a little more patience. And in that, a deeper truth became clear. Transformation does not require persuasion. It does not demand agreement, and it cannot be rushed. Sometimes it begins simply by offering something small again and again without asking for anything in return.
As this story settles, it invites us to consider another truth, that even those who appear unreachable are shaped by the way they are met. And with that understanding, we move gently toward the next story. A visiting scholar once arrived at a small monastery. After a long journey, he had traveled far carrying questions he had collected over many years. Questions about meaning, about discipline, about how to live without being consumed by the constant pressure of thought. He was well-read, intelligent, and eager to make use of every moment of his visit. When he was finally invited to sit with the teacher, the scholar spoke without pause. He asked about suffering. He asked about desire. He asked about how to control the mind. Each question followed the last, layered with explanations and theories as if understanding might be reached by sheer effort. The teacher listened quietly. As the scholar continued speaking, the teacher rose and began to prepare tea. He filled the kettle, placed cups on the table, and waited for the water to boil. The scholar barely noticed, lost in his own stream of thought. When the tea was ready, the teacher poured. He filled the scholar's cup slowly, carefully. But he did not stop when the cup was full. The tea rose to the rim, then spilled over, then continued to pour, flowing across the table and onto the floor. The scholar finally stopped speaking. "Teacher," he exclaimed, "the cup is full. No more will go in." The teacher set the teapot down and looked at him gently. "Yes," he said, "and you are like this cup." The room fell quiet. "You come to me full," the teacher continued. "Full of ideas, full of effort, full of what you already think you know. If I pour anything more into you, it will simply spill out." The scholar felt his face warm with embarrassment. He had not expected this. "Before you can receive," the teacher said, "you must first put the cup down." The scholar did not respond. He stared at the overflowing tea, watching it soak into the floor, disappearing without resistance. For the rest of the visit, he spoke very little. This story is often told as a lesson about learning, but its meaning reaches further than knowledge alone. Many of us move through life with a cup that is always full, full of plans, full of worries, full of expectations and self-demands. We carry this cup everywhere. We grip it tightly, afraid that if we loosen our hold, something essential will be lost. And yet the weight of holding it never leaves us. Over time, the effort becomes exhausting.
We notice that we are more irritable than we used to be, that patience wears thin more quickly, that small inconveniences feel overwhelming. Often we respond by pushing harder. We try to manage our time better. We attempt to think more positively. We search for techniques to calm the mind, but the cup remains full. The teacher's message was not about effort, it was about rest. Putting the cup down does not mean giving up on life. It does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means recognizing when the mind is carrying more than it can hold. When we refuse to rest, tension accumulates quietly. It shows up in the body as tight shoulders, shallow breath, restless sleep. It shows up in the mind as impatience, self-criticism, and a constant sense of urgency. We become less kind, not because we choose to be, but because we are depleted. In moments like these, even compassion feels like work. The scholar realized that his questions were not wrong, but they were arriving from a place of strain. He was trying to do understanding rather than allow it. In the same way, many of us try to force calm into existence. We treat rest as something to earn rather than something necessary. But the cup cannot receive when it is already full. Putting the cup down may look simple from the outside. It may mean stepping away from a conversation before frustration takes over. It may mean closing the book and letting the mind wander. It may mean choosing sleep over productivity, silence over explanation. These choices often feel uncomfortable at first. The mind resists. It warns us that we are falling behind, that we should be doing more. But beneath that resistance, there is relief. When the cup is set down even briefly, the grip loosens, the breath deepens, and the mind discovers that it does not need to hold everything at once. This is not a permanent state. We will pick the cup up again. Life will ask for our attention. Responsibilities will return. But each time we learn to put it down, even for a moment, we remember something important. We are not meant to carry everything without pause. Rest is not weakness. It is wisdom. And without it, even the clearest understanding has nowhere to land. As this image settles, it gently prepares us for another story, one that reveals how rest and absence can sometimes bring out the best in those we love. There is a simple truth many people discover only after they are exhausted. They are kinder when they have rested. It often reveals itself in ordinary moments, not through teaching or reflection, but through the quiet honesty of someone close. A parent once decided to attend a short meditation retreat. It was nothing elaborate, just a few days away from work, from noise, from constant responsibility. Before leaving, they worried about being absent, about letting others down, about whether taking time for themselves was selfish. When they returned, something unexpected happened. Their child looked up at them and said very plainly, "You're nicer when you come back." There was no accusation in the words, no analysis, just observation. The parent felt a pause inside. They had not realized how much strain they had been carrying, or how subtly it had been spilling into daily interactions. Short replies, impatience, a constant sense of being rushed, even when nothing urgent was happening. They had believed they were managing well, but rest had revealed the truth. When the body is tired, kindness requires effort. When the mind is overloaded, patience feels scarce. And when rest is postponed for too long, even love can begin to feel like a demand. The parent noticed that after returning, small things no longer triggered irritation so quickly. Conversations felt less heavy. Listening required less willpower. It was not that life had changed, but their capacity to meet it had expanded. This realization can be uncomfortable. Many of us pride ourselves on endurance, on pushing through fatigue, on showing up no matter what. And while commitment has its place, it often comes at a quiet cost. We begin to mistake depletion for normalcy. We tell ourselves that everyone feels this way, that impatience is just part of adulthood, that being constantly tired is unavoidable. But the child's words cut through those assumptions with clarity. You're nicer when you come back. Not because you are trying harder, not because you have learned something new, but because you have rested. This insight shifts how we understand care. Caring for others is not separate from caring for ourselves. They are deeply connected. When we ignore our need for rest, we do not become more generous, we become brittle. We lose flexibility. We react instead of respond. The parent realized that taking time away was not an escape from responsibility, but a return to it with more presence and less strain. This does not mean everyone needs to leave for a retreat. Rest takes many forms. It may be an afternoon without plans, a walk without a destination, a night of sleep without interruption. What matters is not the form, but the effect. Rest restores the space from which kindness arises naturally. Without it, we may still do the right things, say the right words, fulfill our roles. But something essential feels missing, and those closest to us notice. The child did not say you're wiser. They did not say you're calmer. They said you're nicer. Kindness. It turns out is often the first thing to return when rest is allowed. As this realization settles, it leads us toward a deeper understanding of how the way we speak and the way we listen can either protect or disturb the peace we carry. Words are among the most powerful tools we use each day, and yet they are often the least examined. We speak automatically. We respond quickly. We explain, defend, correct, and advise often, without noticing the effect our words leave behind. Most of us believe the conflict comes from what is said, but just as often, it comes from how it is said and from the state of mind from which it arises. In a small village, there once lived a teacher, known not for eloquence but for restraint. When people came to him with questions, they were often surprised by how little he spoke. He did not rush to answer. He did not offer opinions unless asked directly, and even then his words were chosen with care, as though each one carried weight. One afternoon, a villager approached him, visibly upset. "I need to tell my brother the truth," the man said. "He has made mistakes that affect all of us. If I don't speak plainly, nothing will change." The teacher listened without interrupting. "I'm afraid," the villager continued, "that if I soften my words, he won't understand how serious this is." The teacher nodded slowly. "And are you speaking to help him?" he asked, "or to release your own frustration?" The question landed heavily. The villager hesitated. He had not considered that distinction. He had rehearsed the conversation in his mind many times, each version sharper than the last. He told himself that honesty required firmness, even pain. But the teacher's question revealed something uncomfortable. Often, we confuse truth with force. We believe that if our words hurt, it means they are effective, that if someone feels defensive, it must be because they needed to hear what we said. And so we justify harshness in the name of honesty. But honesty without care rarely leads to understanding. The teacher invited the villager to sit. Truth, he said, can be spoken in many ways. Some ways close the door. Others leave it open. He explained that before speaking, it is helpful to pause and ask 3 simple questions. Is what I am about to say true? Is it necessary, and is it kind, not kind in the sense of being pleasant or agreeable, but kind in the sense of being aimed at reducing harm? The villager frowned. But what if the truth is uncomfortable? He asked. The teacher smiled gently. Truth often is, he replied, but discomfort does not require cruelty. He went on to explain that when words arise from anger, they may be accurate, but they are rarely skillful. They carry the heat of reaction, and that heat is felt immediately by the listener. The body tightens, the mind prepares its defense, and whatever truth was offered is lost in the noise of self-protection. The teacher told the villager to imagine holding a fragile object. If you grip it too tightly, he said, you break it. If you hold it too loosely, you drop it. Speaking truth is like this. It requires steadiness. This idea was unfamiliar to the villager. He had always equated honesty with directness and directness with strength. But now he began to see that strength could also mean restraint. That evening, the villager reflected on past conversations, moments when he had spoken quickly and felt justified only to watch the relationship fray. Times when he had won the argument but lost trust, situations where the truth was delivered but never received. He realized that his goal had often been relief, not understanding. Speaking had felt like unloading a burden, but the burden did not disappear, it was simply transferred. The teacher's guidance offered a different approach, to speak not from urgency, but from clarity, to wait until the body was calm, to choose words that could be heard, not just spoken. This did not mean avoiding difficult conversations. It meant entering them differently, with patience, with awareness, with an understanding that the purpose of speech is not expression alone, but connection. The villager left that day without a script, without rehearsed lines. Instead, he carried a question with him, one he would return to again and again. Am I speaking to be right or to be helpful? That question did not make conversations easier, but it made them more honest. And slowly, he noticed something change. When his words softened, others listened longer. When he paused, defensiveness eased. When he spoke with care, even difficult truths found a place to land. In the next part, we will explore how this practice of mindful speech can also transform the way we receive criticism and what it means to listen without closing the heart. If speaking with care is one side of mindful communication, listening is the other, and often the more difficult one. Most of us believe we are listening when we are silent, but silence alone does not mean openness. Frequently, it is only a pause while the mind prepares its response. We listen to reply. We listen to correct. We listen to defend ourselves before the other person has even finished speaking. And when criticism appears, this habit becomes even stronger. The villager soon discovered this for himself. Not long after his conversation with the teacher, he found himself on the receiving end of difficult words. A neighbor approached him, frustrated about a shared responsibility that had gone neglected. You said you would take care of it, the neighbor said, and you didn't. The villager felt his body react immediately. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched. Explanations rushed to the surface of his mind. He wanted to interrupt, to justify, to remind the neighbor of all the times he had been reliable. But the teacher's words returned to him. Am I speaking to be right or to be helpful? This time he asked a different question. Am I listening to understand or to protect myself? He noticed how quickly the urge to defend had appeared and how convincing it felt. The mind offered many reasons why the criticism was unfair, but beneath those reasons was something simpler: discomfort. Criticism touches a sensitive place. It threatens our sense of being capable, responsible, or good. And so we react often without realizing that the reaction itself prevents understanding. The villager took a slow breath and said nothing. He let the neighbor finish speaking. What he heard beneath the frustration surprised him. The words were sharp, but the feeling beneath them was concern. The neighbor was worried that things were slipping out of balance, that trust was weakening. When the villager finally spoke, his voice was steadier than he expected. You're right, he said. I didn't follow through. I should have told you sooner. The neighbor paused, caught off guard. There was no argument, no escalation, no need to prove anything. The conversation ended quickly, not because the issue was dismissed, but because it had been received. Later, the villager reflected on how different the exchange had felt. He had not lost anything by listening. He had not diminished himself by admitting fault, and he had not surrendered his dignity by remaining open. In fact, the opposite had occurred. By listening without resistance, he had created space for resolution. The tension dissolved not through persuasion but through presence. The teacher later explained this gently. When we close ourselves to criticism, he said, we protect an image, but when we remain open, we protect the relationship. This did not mean accepting every criticism as truth. Some words are spoken from misunderstanding or pain. Discernment is still necessary, but discernment requires calm. If we react immediately, we cannot tell what is useful from what is not. Everything feels like an attack, and in defending ourselves, we often miss the small portion of truth that could help us grow. Listening then becomes an act of courage. It asks us to stay present when we would rather escape, to feel discomfort without turning it into conflict, to trust that our worth does not depend on being flawless. The villager practiced this again and again. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he failed, but slowly a pattern emerged. When he listened fully, conversation shortened. When he resisted, less problems resolved more easily. When he let go of the need to appear right, he found himself more often at peace. The teacher had never promised that mindful speech and listening would make life comfortable, only that they would make it clearer. And clarity, the villager learned, is far gentler than constant defense. As this understanding settles, it brings us to a brief story that captures the essence of criticism and response in a single simple image. A monk once approached a well-known teacher with anger, written plainly across his face. He had traveled far, carrying a list of grievances he could no longer keep inside. As soon as he stood before the teacher, the words poured out. Accusations, insults, sharp judgments delivered with precision and intensity. You are wrong, the monk said. Your teachings are misleading. You deceive people with calm words. Those nearby watched closely, waiting for the teacher to respond. Some expected a defense. Others anticipated correction or authority. The air felt tight, as it often does when confrontation demands an answer. But the teacher did not interrupt. He listened quietly, his posture relaxed, his attention steady. When the monk finally stopped speaking, breath heavy and eyes burning with expectation, the teacher asked a single question. "If someone offers you a gift," he said, "and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The monk frowned. "To the one who offered it," he replied. The teacher nodded. "And so it is with anger," he said. "If I do not receive it, it remains with you." Silence filled the space. The monk stood, frozen, unsure how to respond. His words, which moments ago had felt powerful and necessary, now hung in the air without a place to land. The teacher continued gently. "When you speak with anger, you are offering it to me. I am free to accept it or not. I choose not to." This idea unsettled the monk. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for argument. But there was nothing to push against. Anger requires participation. Without it, it loses direction. The monk felt something shift inside him. Not relief, but confusion. He realized that much of his frustration had depended on the teacher reacting. Without that reaction, the anger felt incomplete, almost awkward. The teacher did not dismiss the monk's concerns. He did not say the words were wrong. He simply refused to carry the emotional weight that accompanied them. In doing so, he revealed something important. We often believe that when someone speaks harshly to us, we must respond in kind. That silence means agreement. That calm means weakness. But the teacher showed another possibility. We can hear words without absorbing their poison. We can acknowledge criticism without inheriting its tone. We can remain present without becoming reactive. The monk left that day without apology and without resolution, but he carried something new with him. A question that lingered longer than anger ever had. If no one takes the gift of my anger, why am I carrying it? As this image settles, it gently invites us to consider how often we accept emotional gifts without realizing we have a choice. After leaving the teacher, the monk carried the question with him for many days. If anger is a gift and if it can be refused, then how often had he accepted it without noticing? He began to observe his daily encounters more closely. A sharp comment during work, an impatient tone during conversation, a dismissive glance that lingered longer than it should. Each time he noticed a familiar impulse to tense, to react, to carry the weight of what had been offered. It felt automatic, almost polite, as if accepting the emotion were part of listening. But now something had changed. He remembered the teacher's calm, the simple question, the refusal that required no force, and he began to experiment. When harsh words came his way, he listened to the meaning without absorbing the heat. He paid attention to the content, but not the charge. It was not easy. The body still reacted. The mind still flared. But instead of following those reactions, he paused. Do I need to take this with me? Often the answer was no. He realized that much of what people express in moments of anger is not information but overflow. It spills out because there is nowhere else for it to go. And when someone receives it fully, emotion and all, it simply transfers the burden. This understanding brought relief. He no longer felt responsible for carrying every emotional exchange to completion. He could remain present without becoming involved. He could acknowledge words without inheriting their weight. This did not make him distant. In fact, it made him more available. Without the need to defend himself, he could listen more clearly. Without reacting, he could see what was actually being said beneath the tone. And often beneath anger there was fear. Beneath accusation, confusion. Beneath harshness, pain. One afternoon, another monk spoke to him sharply about a mistake during a shared task. The familiar tension rose, but this time the monk noticed it and let it pass. "I see what you're pointing out," he said calmly. "I'll correct it." There was no apology beyond what was necessary. No justification. No resentment carried forward. The conversation ended. Later, he reflected on how light the moment felt once it was over. In the past, such an exchange would have followed him through the day. He would have replayed it in his mind, sharpening his own words in silence. Now there was nothing to replay. The gift had not been accepted. This practice extended beyond anger. He noticed how easily people offer expectations, judgments, and assumptions. Not all of them are meant to be carried. Some are projections, some are habits, some are simply expressions of the speaker's state of mind. Learning to discern what belongs to us and what does not is a quiet form of freedom. It does not require withdrawal. It does not require confrontation. It requires clarity. The monk began to understand that boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They allow what is useful to pass through and let the rest remain where it originated. In modern life, this skill becomes essential. We receive opinions constantly, advice we did not ask for, criticism from people who barely know us. Without awareness, we take it all in. We carry voices that were never meant to live inside us. Over time, this accumulation becomes heavy. The teacher's lesson offers another way. We can listen without agreement. We can hear without absorbing. We can respond without reacting. This does not mean ignoring feedback. When words contain truth, they can be received thoughtfully. But truth does not require hostility to be valid, and hostility does not make truth clearer. By separating the message from the emotional charge, the monk found he could grow without harm. He corrected mistakes more easily. He felt less defensive. He slept with a quieter mind. Most importantly, he discovered that peace is not something others can take from us without permission. When we accept every emotional gift offered, we give away that permission freely. But when we choose consciously, we reclaim it. The monk returned to the teacher one final time. "I think I understand," he said. "Anger only stays with me if I hold it." The teacher smiled. "Yes," he replied, "and when you stop holding it, your hands are free. Free to act with wisdom, free to respond with care, free to walk through the world without carrying what was never yours to begin with." As this understanding settles, it gently turns our attention inward toward a relationship that shapes every other one we have, the relationship with ourselves. There is a realization that often arrives quietly after we have spent years trying to manage the world around us. It is the understanding that the most difficult person we encounter is not a stranger, a colleague, or even a loved one. It is ourselves. Not the self we present to others, but the voice that follows us everywhere. The one that comments on every action. The one that measures, compares, and judges without pause. This voice speaks early in the morning and late at night. It notices mistakes instantly. It remembers failures long after others have forgotten them, and unlike difficult people in the outside world, this one is impossible to avoid. For many, this inner presence feels normal, familiar, even useful. It motivates, It pushes, it warns against complacency, but over time its tone hardens. Encouragement turns into pressure, guidance becomes criticism. You should be better. You're falling behind. You should know this by now. These words rarely sound cruel when we first hear them. They often sound reasonable, responsible, even necessary, but the body responds to them nonetheless. The shoulders tighten, the breath shortens, the mind stays restless, scanning for what might go wrong next. Many people discover that they speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to anyone else. They withhold patience. They deny rest. They expect constant improvement without pause. And when exhaustion follows, they respond not with care but with more pressure. The monk had noticed this voice long before he recognized its impact. In moments of quiet when no one else was present, it grew louder. It commented on his meditation, pointing out every distraction. It compared his progress to others. It reminded him of moments when he had fallen short of his own ideals. At first, he believed this voice was part of discipline. Surely practice required honesty. Surely growth required acknowledging flaws. But something did not feel right. The voice did not guide him toward clarity. It drove him toward tension. It did not invite curiosity. It demanded correction. And no matter how much he improved, it was never satisfied. One evening, the monk brought this concern to a senior teacher. "I understand how to meet difficult people with patience," he said. "But when it comes to myself, I don't know how to stop being harsh." The teacher listened carefully. "Tell me," he asked, "how do you treat a friend who is struggling?" The monk considered this. "I listen," he said. "I try to understand, I encourage them. And when you struggle?" The teacher asked. The monk hesitated. "I criticize myself," he admitted. "I tell myself to do better." The teacher nodded. "Then you have discovered the problem." He explained that many people believe self-criticism leads to improvement, but more often it leads to fear. And fear narrows attention. It limits creativity. It drains energy. When the mind feels under attack, even from within, it does not open. It braces. The teacher continued. "There is a difference," he said, "between seeing clearly and speaking harshly. Clarity says this is what is happening. Harshness says this should not be happening." The monk felt the truth of this immediately. His inner voice rarely described. It condemned, and in doing so, it created a constant sense of urgency, a feeling that peace was always just out of reach, dependent on becoming someone else. The teacher did not suggest silencing the inner voice. That would only create another struggle. Instead, he invited the monk to notice its tone. "Listen to how you speak to yourself," he said. Not the words alone, but the feeling behind them. Over the following days, the monk paid attention. He noticed how quickly judgment arose, how easily effort turned into strain, how often kindness disappeared the moment it was needed most. This awareness did not change the voice immediately, but it revealed something important. The harshness was not helping. It was not making him more disciplined. It was not making him wiser. It was making him tired. And in that fatigue, even the simplest practices felt heavy. The monk began to understand that self-compassion was not indulgence. It was not lowering standards or avoiding responsibility. It was a different way of relating to effort itself. Effort, supported by kindness, felt sustainable. Effort driven by fear did not. This realization marked the beginning of a new kind of practice. One that did not start with fixing, but with listening.
one that did not demand change but allowed it. One that recognized that the inner relationship sets the tone for every other relationship we have. Before the monk could learn how to soften this inner voice, he first had to see it clearly. And that clarity for the first time felt gentle.
In the next part, we will explore a simple story that reveals what happens when a person learns to become good company for themselves. There was once a monk who chose to live alone in a small hut at the edge of the forest. He did not leave the monastery out of conflict or disappointment. He simply felt called to spend time in silence, away from distraction where nothing would remain hidden. No conversations to escape into, no duties to postpone reflection. Just himself, moment after moment. When others heard of his choice, they were curious. "Aren't you lonely?" one asked. "Don't you miss companionship?" another wondered. The monk smiled gently. "I have company," he said. "I am with myself." At first, the days passed easily. The forest was quiet, the work was simple, the routine was clear. But as weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. The monk began to notice how restless his own presence could be. Thoughts arose without invitation. Memories replayed. Judgments surfaced sharp and unrelenting. In the absence of external distraction, the inner voice grew louder. "You should be more focused. You're wasting time. Others are progressing faster than you." There was nowhere to run from these thoughts. No one to compare notes with. No way to confirm or deny the voice's claims. For the first time, the monk saw clearly how harshly he spoke to himself. The forest offered no commentary. The trees did not judge his effort. The wind did not rush him. Only the voice inside remained critical. One evening, exhausted by his own inner dialogue, the monk sat down outside his hut and watched the sky darken. If I spoke to another person this way, he realized they would leave. The thought stopped him. He had never considered the idea that he might be the one creating discomfort in his own company. That solitude itself was not the problem, but the way he treated himself within it. The next morning, he decided to try something different. When the critical voice arose, he did not argue with it. He did not obey it. He acknowledged it, then softened his response. "I see you," he said quietly. "You're trying to help." The words felt unfamiliar, almost awkward. When impatience appeared, he paused instead of pushing harder. When fatigue surfaced, he rested without guilt. When mistakes happened, he noted them without accusation. At first, this felt unnatural. The mind resisted. It warned him that he was becoming complacent, that discipline would slip. But something else happened. His body relaxed, his breath deepened, and the inner noise gradually lost its edge. Days passed with less tension. Silence became spacious rather than heavy. Solitude no longer felt like a test to endure. One afternoon, a visiting monk asked him, "How is it living alone?" The monk smiled. "I am good company now," he replied. This did not mean the critical voice had disappeared. It still appeared, especially when effort was required, but it no longer dominated the space. It was one voice among many, no longer the one in charge. The monk realized that self-compassion was not about silencing inner criticism. It was about changing the relationship to it. Instead of being ruled by it, he listened with discernment. Instead of punishing himself, he guided himself. This shift made practice sustainable. Without constant self-attack, energy returned. Without fear, curiosity emerged. And without pressure, growth happened naturally. The monk returned to the monastery later that year, not with new insights to share, but with a different presence. He moved more slowly. He listened more deeply. And he met others with the same patience he had learned to offer himself. Those who encountered him sensed the change immediately. There was ease in his manner, a quiet steadiness that did not demand attention. When asked what he had learned in solitude, he answered simply, "How to stay," he said, "even when I am not perfect." In the final part of this story, we will explore how this kindness toward oneself quietly transforms the way we meet the world. When the monk returned from the forest, nothing about him appeared extraordinary at first glance. He wore the same robes, he followed the same schedule, he spoke no more than he had before, and yet those who lived alongside him sensed a difference almost immediately. There was less urgency in his movements, less tension in his voice, and when difficulties arose, as they always do, he did not tighten against them. Someone once asked him what had changed. "I stopped treating myself as a problem," he replied. Before learning self-compassion, the monk had believed that inner pressure was necessary, that without constant correction, he would drift, that kindness toward himself would lead to laziness or indulgence. But what he discovered was the opposite. Harshness drained energy. Kindness restored it. When he no longer fought himself, effort became simpler. He could see mistakes clearly without feeling defeated by them. He could acknowledge limits without shame. And because of this, he was more available to practice, to others, and to the present moment. The inner voice still appeared. It commented. It warned. It pointed out flaws. But now it was met differently. Instead of tightening, the monk listened. Instead of believing every word he asked, whether the message was useful. Instead of responding with punishment, he responded with guidance. This change rippled outward. When others spoke harshly, he no longer felt the need to defend himself. When someone made a mistake, he corrected it without adding weight. When conflict arose, he stayed present instead of withdrawing. Self-compassion had not made him passive, it had made him stable. The monk noticed that many people who struggled with difficult relationships were in fact struggling with themselves. Their impatience with others mirrored the impatience they carried inwardly. Their judgment reflected a voice they heard constantly inside. As he softened toward himself, that reflection changed. He met irritation with curiosity. He met criticism with calm, and he met failure with steadiness. This did not eliminate difficulty. Life continued to present challenges, but difficulty no longer felt personal. It became something to work with rather than something to fight. The monk understood then that self-compassion is not an isolated practice. It shapes every interaction. When we stop attacking ourselves, we stop needing to protect ourselves constantly. When protection relaxes, openness becomes possible. And when openness appears, connection follows naturally. This is why the relationship with oneself is foundational. No amount of patience with others can be sustained if we are at war inside. No amount of kindness outward can last if it is not rooted inwardly. The monk did not speak often about self-compassion. He knew it could easily be misunderstood as comfort or softness. But those who watched him understood its strength. They saw it in how he remained present under pressure. They felt it in how he listened without interruption. They sensed it in how he allowed space for others to be imperfect. Self-compassion had not removed effort from his life. It had removed fear from effort, and in that absence of fear, growth unfolded without force. As this understanding settles, it invites us to look more closely at the moments when others disturb us and to ask what part of ourselves may be asking to be seen. There are moments when a reaction surprises us. A comment that should not matter lingers for hours. A habit in another person triggers irritation, far out of proportion to the situation. A tone of voice, a way of speaking, a small behavior. Suddenly we feel tense, defensive, or judgmental. Often we explain these moments by focusing outward. They are rude, they are careless, they are arrogant. But beneath these explanations, there is sometimes another movement taking place, one that is quieter and more uncomfortable to acknowledge. Projection.
Projection happens when something within us has not yet been accepted, understood, or integrated. Instead of being felt directly, it is seen more clearly and more painfully in others. The monk began to notice this during his daily interactions.
There was a particular quality in others that disturbed him more than any other certainty. When someone spoke with strong confidence, when opinions were stated without hesitation, something tightened inside him. He felt a subtle resistance, followed by judgment. They are too sure of themselves, he thought. They don't listen, they think they are right. At first, he believed this reaction was about the other person's behavior. But as he observed it more closely, a question arose. Why does this bother me so much? There were many people with strong opinions. Not all of them triggered this response, only certain ones did. And the intensity of his reaction did not match the situation. This curiosity led him inward. He noticed that when he himself felt uncertain, when doubt lingered, he became quieter. He held back his thoughts. He feared being wrong, and somewhere inside there was resentment toward those who appeared free from that fear. The certainty he disliked in others reflected something he did not allow in himself. This realization was not comfortable. It challenged the idea that his reactions were always justified. It suggested that some judgments were not observations but reflections. Projection does not mean that what we see in others is false. Behavior is real. Harmful actions are real. Boundaries are necessary. But projection means that our emotional charge often comes from somewhere deeper than the behavior itself. When we react strongly, it is often because something unresolved has been touched. The monk began to watch his reactions more carefully. When impatience arose, he asked, "Where am I being impatient with myself?" When judgment appeared, he asked, "What part of me feels unacceptable right now?" When irritation flared, he asked, "What am I resisting seeing?" These questions did not always bring immediate answers, but they softened the certainty of blame. He realized that projection works quietly. It disguises itself as clarity. It tells us I am right, they are the problem. If they changed, I would be at peace. But peace does not arrive through correction alone. Often it arrives through recognition. The monk remembered a teaching he had once heard. What you dislike most in others is often what you are unwilling to meet in yourself. This did not mean he should approve of everything he disliked. It meant that his reactions were invitations to look inward, to listen, to become more whole. Projection is not a failure. It is information.
It points toward parts of ourselves that have been ignored, judged, or pushed aside. And when those parts remain unseen, they seek expression elsewhere. In relationships, this can create endless conflict. We argue with others about traits we secretly fear or suppress. We criticize behaviors that mirror our own unmet needs. We feel disturbed not because something is wrong, but because something is familiar. As the monk practiced self-compassion, these insights became easier to hold. Without harsh self-judgment, he could look honestly. Without fear, he could acknowledge discomfort. He noticed that when he accepted his own uncertainty, the certainty of others no longer threatened him. When he allowed space for his own ambition, he felt less irritated by ambition in others. When he recognized his own desire to be seen, he judged others less for seeking attention. Projection lost its grip as integration grew. This did not eliminate all reactions, but it changed their meaning. A reaction became a signal rather than a verdict. A judgment became a doorway rather than a wall. The monk understood then that inner work and outer relationships are not separate paths. They inform one another constantly. When we bring awareness to what we project, we reclaim energy that was once spent in conflict. We become less reactive, not because the world has changed, but because we are no longer fighting ourselves through others. And in that shift, relationships soften, not through effort, but through honesty. As this reflection settles, it prepares us for a story about facing difficulty directly and discovering how even what seems to bury us can become the ground we stand on.
There was once a farmer who owned a donkey he relied on every day. The donkey carried water from the well-hauled supplies from the market and walked beside the farmer through long, repetitive routines. It was not a special animal. It did not stand out for strength or intelligence. It simply worked day after day without complaint. One afternoon, as the farmer was tending to his land, he heard a sudden cry. He turned and saw the donkey had fallen into an old well. The well was deep. Its walls were steep, and there was no easy way to pull the animal out. The donkey cried loudly, its voice echoing up from the darkness. The sound was filled with fear and exhaustion. The farmer rushed over and looked down, his heart heavy. He tried to think of a solution. Ropes were too short. The donkey was too heavy. The well was too narrow for ladders or tools. Neighbors gathered. They peered down into the well, offering suggestions at first. But as time passed, their voices grew quieter. Finally, someone spoke what the others were thinking. "The donkey is old," he said. "The well is dry. Maybe it is time to let both go." The farmer felt a deep sadness, but he could not deny the truth of the situation. The well was no longer useful, and rescuing the donkey seemed impossible. After a long pause, he made a decision. If the donkey could not be saved, he would at least end its suffering. He picked up a shovel and began to throw dirt into the well. The donkey cried louder. Each shovel of dirt landed heavily, covering its legs, its back, its sides. Dust filled the air. The weight pressed down, making it harder to move. From above it looked cruel. From below it felt unbearable. The donkey brayed in panic, its cries rising with every load of soil. Those watching turned away. Some covered their ears. No one expected the donkey to last long. The farmer continued his movements, slow and heavy with regret. Shovel after shovel, the well filled. And then something unexpected happened. The donkey stopped crying. Silence rose from the well. The farmer froze, fear tightening his chest. He leaned over the edge and looked down, expecting the worst. But what he saw made him pause. The donkey was still standing, covered in dirt, exhausted but alive. And with each shovel of soil that fell onto its back, the donkey did something no one anticipated. It shook the dirt off, and then it stepped up. Again and again. Dirt fell, the donkey shook it off, and stepped higher. The farmer stood motionless, watching as the animal slowly rose within the well. The same dirt meant to bury it was becoming something else entirely. The neighbors returned to the edge, drawn by the change. No one spoke. They watched as each burden became a step. The donkey did not escape yet. The well was still deep. The effort was still painful, but something had shifted. What was meant to end the donkey's life was now helping it survive. And as the farmer continued to shovel slower, now uncertain, the donkey continued its steady rhythm. Shake, step, breathe. Shake, step, breathe. In the next part of this story, we will see how this simple movement repeated without despair turns an impossible situation into a quiet escape. As the farmer kept shoveling, his movement slowed. What had begun as an act of resignation was now filled with confusion. He was no longer sure whether he was burying the donkey or witnessing something else entirely. Each time the dirt struck the donkey's back, the animal staggered. The weight was real. The effort was visible. But instead of collapsing, the donkey repeated the same simple response. It shook the dirt off, and it stepped up. There was no panic now, no frantic movement, only steady action. Those watching felt something shift inside themselves. The donkey did not fight the dirt. It did not curse the well. It did not waste energy resisting what could not be stopped. It worked with what arrived. Shovel after shovel fell. The donkey's legs trembled. Its breath came heavier. Its body was coated in dust. And yet, with each burden removed from its back, the ground beneath its feet rose. The farmer stopped shoveling altogether and leaned on his tool, watching in silence. For the first time since the donkey had fallen, hope appeared not as a plan, but as a possibility. The donkey was higher now, close enough that the farmer could see its eyes clearly. They were tired but focused. There was no confusion in them, only determination. Finally, with one last effort, the donkey stepped onto the edge of the well and climbed out. It stood there for a moment, shaking the remaining dirt from its coat, breathing deeply. Then it walked away slowly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No celebration followed. No words were spoken. The farmer and the neighbors stood quietly absorbing what they had just witnessed. The well remained what it was. The dirt had not changed. The burden had not disappeared. What had changed was the response. The farmer understood then that the donkey had not escaped, despite the dirt, but because of it. The same weight that threatened to bury it became the very thing that lifted it out. This story is often told as encouragement during difficult times, but its meaning is more precise than simple optimism. It is not saying that difficulty is good. It is not suggesting that suffering should be welcomed. It is pointing to something more subtle. We cannot always choose what falls on us, but we can choose what we do with it. When hardship arrives, our instinct is often to collapse under its weight, to believe that what presses down on us is proof that we cannot continue. And sometimes that belief becomes heavier than the hardship itself. The donkey did not escape because it was strong. It escaped because it did not add despair to effort. It did not ask, "Why is this happening?" It did not wait for the dirt to stop.
It responded again and again in the only way available: shake it off, step up. In human life, this does not mean ignoring pain. It means not letting pain define the future. A mistake becomes a lesson. A loss becomes a pause. A disappointment becomes information. This is not a dramatic transformation. It happens quietly, through repetition, through showing up one moment at a time. The donkey's escape was not sudden. It was built step by step from the very thing that threatened to end it. In the final part of this story, we will reflect on how this image applies to the burdens we carry and how steady response can turn pressure into progress. Long after the donkey had walked away, the image of that well remained with those who had witnessed it. Not because of the escape itself, but because of how it happened. The well did not open. The dirt did not stop falling. No one came to rescue the donkey. What changed was the relationship between the donkey and what pressed down on it. This is where the story quietly speaks to human experience. Many of us find ourselves in wells we did not choose. A series of mistakes, a difficult season, a loss that reshapes everything we thought we understood. At first, the weight feels unbearable. Each new problem lands on top of the last. We tell ourselves we are sinking, that there is no way out, that effort is pointless, when the pressure keeps coming. And so we cry out, we panic, we freeze, but the donkey shows another possibility. It does not deny the weight. It does not pretend the dirt is light. It responds anyway. Shake it off, step up. This response is not heroic. It is practical. In life, shaking it off does not mean forgetting what happened. It means not letting it cling. It means acknowledging pain without allowing it to become identity. And stepping up does not mean leaping out of the well in one move. It means doing the next possible thing even when the situation remains unchanged. A conversation postponed, a small correction made, a single breath taken instead of surrendering to overwhelm. These steps rarely feel like progress at first. They feel insignificant compared to the depth of the well, but over time they accumulate. What once felt like burial becomes foundation. The donkey did not know how deep the well was. It did not calculate the odds. It stayed with the moment in front of it. This is often where human resilience is misunderstood. We think strength means confidence about the future. But often strength is simply the refusal to stop responding. The farmer learned something that day as well. He saw that even when intentions are not kind, outcomes are not always fixed. That sometimes the very things meant to end us become the means by which we survive, if we do not give them more power than they already have. This does not mean every difficulty will lift us. Some burdens require rest. Some situations require help. Some wells are too deep to climb alone. But this story speaks to the moments when we are still standing, still breathing, still capable of response. In those moments, the question is not, how do I escape? It is, how do I respond to what is here right now? The answer does not need to be clever. It does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be repeated. Shake it off. Step up again and again. Over time, something shifts. The ground rises, the air changes, and what once felt impossible becomes simply the next step. As this image settles, it prepares us for one final story, one that reminds us how little we truly know about what events will bring, and why patience with uncertainty
is often the wisest response of all. There was once an old farmer who lived with his son at the edge of a small village. They owned very little: a modest house, a patch of land, and one horse that helped them plow the fields and travel to the market. The villagers often looked at the farmer with curiosity. He did not speak much, and when he did, his words were few. One morning, the farmer's horse ran away. It happened without warning. The gate had been left open, or perhaps the rope had loosened during the night. By the time the farmer noticed, the horse was gone, disappeared into the hills beyond the village. News traveled quickly. Neighbors gathered at the farmer's home, shaking their heads. "How unfortunate," they said. "What terrible luck. Without that horse, how will you manage?" The farmer listened quietly. "Maybe," he replied. "We shall see." The villagers were puzzled. The loss seemed obvious. The consequences felt clear. Yet the farmer did not appear distressed. He did not argue. He did not agree. He simply returned to his work. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The horse returned, and it was not alone. Trailing behind it were several wild horses from the hills, drawn back by the familiar path. Suddenly, the farmer had more animals than he had ever owned. The villagers returned amazed. "How wonderful," they exclaimed. "What great fortune. You must be very happy." The farmer looked at the horses, then at the people gathered around him. "Maybe," he said again. "We shall see." This response unsettled them even more than before. How could someone remain so neutral in the face of clear gain? Why not celebrate? Why not claim victory over misfortune? The villagers left whispering among themselves. Not long after, the farmer's son began training one of the wild horses. It was strong and unpredictable. During one attempt to ride it, the horse reared suddenly. The son was thrown to the ground and broke his leg badly. Once again, the villagers came. "This is awful," they said. "Such bad luck. Your only son injured like this." The farmer sat beside his son, tending to him calmly. "Maybe," he said. "We shall see." This time the villagers were frustrated. How could he not see the pattern? How could he remain unmoved when events clearly swung between good and bad? But the farmer did not explain himself. He did not need to. Soon after, soldiers arrived in the village. A war had begun, and all able-bodied young men were being conscripted into the army. Homes were visited one by one. Sons were taken away. When the soldiers reached the farmer's house, they saw the boy's injured leg and moved on. The son was spared. The villagers returned one final time, their expressions different now. "You were right," they said. What seemed bad became good. "You were wise not to judge." The farmer listened as he always had. "Maybe," he replied. "We shall see." The villagers laughed uneasily. Some understood, others did not. The farmer's words were not a refusal to feel. They were not indifference. They were an acknowledgement of something most people resist: that we do not know what events will bring. We label experiences quickly: good, bad, lucky, unlucky, but life rarely reveals its meaning in a single moment. What feels like loss may open a door. What feels like gain may carry unseen consequences. And what seems clear today may look very different tomorrow. The farmer was not detached from life. He worked, he cared for his son, he tended his animals, but he did not rush to conclusions. He allowed events to unfold without forcing a story onto them. This does not mean passivity. It means patience. Patience with uncertainty, patience with incomplete information, patience with the discomfort of not knowing. Most suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the labels we attach to them, from the certainty with which we declare, "This should not have happened," or "This must mean something terrible." The farmer's response offered another option: to meet life with openness, to allow time to reveal what cannot be seen immediately, to act when action is needed without clinging to judgment. In doing so, he remained steady through change. When loss came, he did not collapse. When gain arrived, he did not cling. He stayed with what was in front of him, without trying to predict what it meant. This way of living does not promise comfort. It promises balance. It allows us to move through events without being thrown off course by every shift in fortune. It creates space between what happens and how we respond. And in that space, wisdom has room to grow. In the next and final part of this story, we will explore how letting go of judgment allows life to unfold more gently, and why uncertainty, when met with patience, can become a source of quiet peace. In the days that followed, the villagers often thought about the farmer's words. "Maybe. We shall see." They repeated them in their minds when things went wrong, and again when things seemed to go right. Slowly, they began to understand that the farmer was not avoiding reality. He was refusing to trap it inside a judgment too early. Life, the farmer knew, is a long unfolding. Events arrive one by one, but their meaning is rarely revealed at the moment of arrival. What looks like an ending may be the middle of something larger. What appears to be a beginning may carry its own quiet ending within it. The farmer tended his fields as he always had. He cared for his son while his leg healed. He trained the remaining horses gently without urgency. Nothing in his daily life suggested detachment or indifference. He was fully present. When neighbors asked him why he remained so calm, he answered simply, "I do not know what this will become," he said, "so I leave room for it." This way of living does not require belief or philosophy. It requires humility. Humility to admit that our view is partial. Humility to accept that time reveals what thought cannot. Humility to stay open when certainty would feel more comfortable. Most of us rush to judgment because uncertainty is uncomfortable. It leaves us without footing. It threatens the illusion that we are in control. But certainty has its own cost. When we label an event as bad, we close ourselves to what might grow from it. When we label it as good, we cling, fearing its loss. In both cases, we tighten around the moment and tension follows. The farmer's response offered a middle way, not denial, not passivity, but patience. By withholding judgment, he preserved his ability to respond wisely. He acted when action was needed. He rested when rest was possible. He did not waste energy resisting what had already happened. Over time, the villagers noticed that those who judged quickly suffered more. They rose high with fortune and fell hard with loss. Their emotions were pulled back and forth by every change. The farmer moved differently. He was steady when others panicked. He was calm when others celebrated. He met each moment without adding excess meaning to it. This did not make him cold. It made him resilient. Resilience does not come from predicting outcomes. It comes from meeting uncertainty without fear. The farmer did not need to know how the story would end. He trusted that clarity would come in its own time. And because of that trust, he was free to live fully in the present rather than anxiously anticipating the future. As the villagers began to practice this way of seeing even imperfectly, they noticed something surprising. Moments felt lighter, losses felt less personal, and gains felt less fragile. They still felt joy, they still felt sorrow, but they were no longer consumed by either. The farmer's simple words had planted something deeper than advice.
They had introduced a way of relating to life that did not depend on certainty, a way that allowed peace to exist alongside change. As this final story settles, it gently opens the way for us to bring all we have heard into a single quiet understanding.
There was a village that stood beside a wide, slow-moving river. For generations, the people of the village had lived in rhythm with the water. They drew from it, crossed it, and rested near its banks at the end of long days. The river was always there, unchanging in presence, yet never the same from one moment to the next. Children played along its edge. Elders sat nearby watching it pass, and travelers often paused there, drawn by something they could not quite name. One summer, a young man arrived in the village, carrying a quiet frustration. He had traveled far, moving from place to place in search of clarity. Each stop had promised answers, teachings, methods, paths forward, and each time he left feeling more restless than before. The villagers noticed his unease. He walked quickly. He spoke impatiently, and when he sat near the river, his gaze searched the water as if expecting it to reveal something immediately. One evening, an old woman who lived near the river approached him. "You look as though you are waiting for something," she said. "I am," the young man replied. "I'm trying to understand my life." The woman nodded and sat beside him without comment. Together, they watched the river move past. After a long silence, the young man spoke again. "I feel as though I'm always behind," he said. "No matter how much I learn or change, it never feels like enough. Others seem to know where they are going. I feel like I'm always catching up." The woman listened carefully. "Do you see the river?" she asked. "Yes," the young man said. "That's why I came here." "Then watch it," she replied. "Not to understand it, just to see it." They sat quietly as the water flowed by. The young man noticed how the river moved around stones without effort, how it slowed near the bank and quickened where the path narrowed, how leaves fell into it and drifted away without resistance. "What are you waiting for?" the woman asked gently. "I don't know," the young man admitted. "A sign, maybe, a moment when things finally make sense." The woman smiled. "The river does not wait for understanding," she said. "It moves anyway." The young man frowned. "But it knows where it's going." The woman shook her head. "It does not," she said. "It responds to what is here." That night, the young man slept near the river. The sound of water moving over stone followed him into rest. In the morning, he returned to the same place. He watched again, and slowly, something began to shift. He noticed that the river never hurried, yet never stopped. It did not compare itself to other rivers. It did not measure progress. It simply met each curve, each obstacle, each opening as it arrived. Days passed. The young man stayed in the village longer than he intended. Each morning he sat by the river. Each evening he returned, and in that repetition, a realization formed not suddenly, but gradually. His suffering did not come from not knowing enough. It came from believing he should be somewhere else. He had been treating life like a destination rather than a movement. The woman noticed the change in him. "You are quieter," she said one evening. "I'm not trying so hard," he replied. She nodded. "Trying to arrive is exhausting," she said. "Living is not." The young man began to see how much of his energy had been spent resisting the present moment. He was always preparing for what came next, correcting what had already passed, or measuring himself against a future version he believed he should become. But the river did none of this. It did not carry regret. It did not anticipate success. It did not rush toward an imagined end. It moved. One afternoon, a storm arrived. Rain fell heavily upstream and the river swelled. Its surface grew restless. The water moved faster, darker, louder. The young man felt a familiar tension rise inside him. "What if it overflows?" he asked. The woman watched the water closely. "Sometimes it does," she said, "and when it does, the land is nourished." The young man thought of the times his own life had overflowed. Moments of loss, overwhelm, and collapse. He had always seen them as failures, interruptions, proof that something had gone wrong. But the river did not apologize for swelling. It adjusted. When the storm passed, the river returned to its familiar rhythm. The land around it looked richer, darker, alive. That night, the young man spoke softly. "I've been afraid of slowing down," he said. "Afraid that if I stop pushing, I'll fall behind forever." The woman smiled. Behind what she asked, the question lingered. Behind expectations, behind imagined timelines, behind stories that were never truly his. The young man realized that much of his urgency came from comparison, watching others move and assuming they were ahead. But the river showed him something different. Movement does not need comparison. Presence does not need validation. And life does not require speed to be meaningful. On his final day in the village, the young man packed his things. Before leaving, he returned to the river one last time. "I don't feel finished," he told the woman. She nodded. "You never will," she said kindly. "That's the point." He laughed softly, not in frustration but in relief. As he walked away, the river continued behind him, unchanged, unbothered, unhurried. And for the first time in a long while, the young man did not feel the need to catch up to his own life. As this final image settles, you may notice how little effort the river requires and how gently it carries everything it meets. There is nothing you need to reach tonight and nowhere you need to arrive. Like the river, you are already in motion. There was a man who believed he was lost. Not lost in the sense of not knowing where he was, but lost in the sense of feeling slightly out of place no matter where he stood. Wherever he went, something felt incomplete. If he stayed, he wondered what he was missing elsewhere. If he left, he questioned whether he should have remained. And when things were calm, his mind quietly searched for what might soon go wrong. Over time, this restlessness became familiar. It followed him like a shadow, never loud, never dramatic, but always present. One evening, after a long walk with no destination, the man found himself standing before an old building at the edge of the town. It was unremarkable. Stone walls, softened by age. A wooden door slightly worn. A single window glowing faintly from within. He did not know why he stopped there. He simply did. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was quiet. There was no furniture except for a low chair near the wall. No decoration, no signs of use. Yet the space felt strangely familiar, as though it had been waiting without expectation. The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The silence was not empty. It was complete. He sat down. At first, his thoughts moved quickly. Why am I here? How long should I stay? Is this a mistake? But the room did not respond. It did not reassure him. It did not challenge him. It simply remained. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer. Time felt different there. Gradually, something slowed. The questions lost urgency. The body softened into the chair. The breath deepened without instruction. The man noticed something unexpected. For the first time in a long while, he was not waiting for the moment to end. There was nothing to do in the room, nothing to improve, nothing to prepare for, and without realizing it, the effort to manage his experience began to fade. Memories surfaced, old regrets, unfinished conversations, choices he still questioned. Normally, these would tighten his chest, pull him back into familiar loops. But here they appeared and passed like faint echoes in a large space. He did not follow them. He did not push them away. They simply came, and then they left. The man felt a quiet recognition arise. This is what I have been avoiding, he thought. Not the world, not people, but stillness without direction. He had spent years believing that peace would arrive after something changed, after understanding, improved after circumstances aligned, after effort paid off. But in this room, nothing had changed. And yet peace was present. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady. At some point, the man stood and walked slowly around the room. He ran his hand along the wall. It was cool, solid, real. "This place feels familiar," he said aloud, surprising himself. The words lingered in the air unanswered. Then it occurred to him. The room did not feel familiar because he had been there before. It felt familiar because he had never truly left it. This stillness, the one he was touching now, had always been available beneath the movement of his life. It was not something to be reached, it was something to be noticed. He had simply been too busy standing at the door, imagining where else he needed to go. The man returned to the chair and sat again. This time there was no search, no effort to hold the moment, no fear of losing it. He understood without words that this room was not a destination. It was a reminder that beneath planning, beneath striving, beneath the endless adjustments of the mind, there is a place that does not move, and that place does not demand anything. When the man finally stood to leave, there was no sense of departure. He opened the door and stepped back into the night. The town looked the same. The air felt cooler. The sounds returned. And yet something had shifted. He did not feel found. He felt settled. As he walked home, thoughts returned as they always do. Plans, memories, concerns, but they no longer carried the same weight. He knew now that no matter where he went, no matter what unfolded, the room was not behind him. It was here, always. As this story comes to rest, you may sense that nothing needs to be resolved tonight. There is nowhere else you need to go and nothing you need to become. Like the quiet room, rest is already present, waiting without effort. As the stories come to a close, there is no final lesson to memorize, no conclusion you need to reach, and nothing you are required to carry forward. What you have heard is not meant to be held tightly. It is meant to settle. Each story has pointed in its own quiet way toward the same understanding, not as an answer, but as a direction. That struggle often grows when we resist it, that people soften when they are met without force, that rest restores what effort alone cannot. That kindness toward others and toward ourselves is not weakness, but stability, and that life rarely reveals its meaning all at once. Here in this long and gentle night, stories are not meant to awaken the mind, but to give it permission to rest. This is the quiet space that the long night was created for. A place where nothing needs to be solved and nothing needs to be rushed. We have seen how anger loses its power when it is not fed.
How difficult people can become teachers when we stop fighting them. How patience applied consistently reaches places force never will. You do not need to remember every story. You do not need to carry every word with you. Let them fade naturally, the way thoughts do when sleep begins to arrive. As you rest now, you may notice the body growing heavier, the breath slowing and the mind loosening its grip. And if tomorrow brings challenges, as it surely will, perhaps something from this long night will remain. Not as advice, but as a softer way of meeting what comes. For now there is nothing more to do. Just rest. Good night and welcome to the rest of the long night.